Hi there, my name is Dr. Stace Constantinou. I'm a senior lecturer and the programme leader for popular music at the University of Northampton. Hi Mark, thank you so much for coming today. Mark, you've been a writer at The Guardian since 1995. You also write for The Independent, The Tablet, The New Statesman and Radio Times. You've been a series writer for the TV show Absolute Power, 2003, and you've written for the TV series Screenplay from 1986. You've starred in Ricky Gervais Extras, and as a broadcaster, you've directed and presented Mark Lawson Talks for the BBC Radio 4 from 2003 to 2015. You also work as a broadcaster for foreign bodies, Radio 4, The Late Review and Newsnight. You were the main presenter for the flagship BBC Radio 4 arts programme Front Row between 1998 and 2014. You've interviewed many famous musicians, including Phil Collins, Tom Jones, Alice Cooper, Bob Geldof, Noel Gallagher, Brian Eno and Björk. And you've also interviewed the film director Ridley Scott. I believe you've interviewed or you've conducted over 3,500 interviews to date. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here. What got you into the arts and culture in the first place?
I always wanted to be a journalist and broadcaster. I think the journalism bit, the reason is that, we are prisoners of our childhoods to a large degree, and a happy prisoner in this case, because my dad he was a civil servant, but he brought home every newspaper every day. And it shaped my life. I can see that now, that, most people, well, some people grow up without a newspaper in the house, but most people have one. And then, as you grow up, you can recognise, Guardian households and Telegraph households, Daily Mail. We had the whole lot. And so from the age of probably about 8, I was conscious that all these newspapers reported things in different ways and using different language. And so, that made me want to be a journalist. So I was very conscious of a huge range of writers, from these names will mean nothing now, but which is the poignancy of journalism. But Jean Rook in the Express and Bernard Levin in the Times. I was reading all these people. Clive James in the Observer, and I wanted to be Clive James, I think. So I always wanted to be a TV critic, an arts critic, and that's. And the reason it would be an arts critic is that I was obsessed with the arts, and I always was. I went. My parents, they'd probably be, social services would step in these days, but for my 7th birthday, my parents I have a twin sister, they took us to see Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard, which I'm pretty conscious changed my life. Because I didn't know, for people who don't know, it's a variation on Hamlet in which he takes 2 minor characters and writes a whole play about them. I didn't know what Hamlet was at the time, but it shows the brilliance of that play, and I've been lucky to interview Sir Tom several times, but it starts with these 2 attendant lords in Shakespeare having a coin-tossing competition for money. And I'm afraid I have counted it. It comes down 85 times heads. And I have a son who's a data analyst. And so what we have to say is that it's improbable, but it's not impossible that a coin would come down heads 85 times, or the other way around. Yeah. But I just remember it was so funny, and still is when you see it. And there was this guy at the back walking up and down with a book, very busy, and then he came in and they had a conversation with him. Went to the theatre a lot. But my parents, well, they were Catholic in both senses, actually. My parents, with a big C and a little c, but they took us to So I saw The Mousetrap when I was very young. And I think, which also, Stoppard wrote a parody of that as well, which is The Real Inspector Hound. And when I look back, and I'm not, I mean, for all my faults, I'm not a cultural snob, I think. Because we were seeing stuff, Why Not Stay for Breakfast with Derek, Nimmo, and all these, Vickers, Where's My Knickers, and all that kind of stuff. We used to go to the whole lot, but also Shakespeare. And so it was, in that sense, a Catholic with a small C education, and that again shaped my life, I think.
So you fulfilled your life's, your childhood desires.
Yes, which is, the more people you meet as you get older, it is very unusual. I mean, I have 3 children. One of mine wanted to be an astronaut. And he was very happy as a doctor, but he didn't become an astronaut. And I think one of the others wanted to be a princess and didn't. And it's more common with writers than anyone else because it's something that children do, or artists. The things you do in childhood, or football. I mean, I go to... we'll give a shout out to the Northampton Town, of whom I'm a season ticket holder.
They beat Huddersfield recently.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Although we're talking on the day before they play Wrexham, so I'm very, very apprehensive. But as anyone who has watched the TV series will know why. But yeah, you meet a lot of footballers who want to do it from the age of 8. But then on the other hand, most boys want to be footballers from the age of 8, and most don't achieve it. So yes, you're right. It's incredibly lucky and privileged to have been able to achieve what I wanted to do.
I wasn't thinking lucky or privileged. I was thinking that's kind of really, you must be so driven.
Yeah, it's odd. I never had any doubts. And I, when I look back, I mean, it's when I wrote an essay, it's in those days, for younger listeners, we wrote on paper with a pen. And when I finished, I say essay, whatever they call it, composition or story, if it was 2 or 3 pages, say, or later on an essay, I would always look at the wall opposite my desk and square the papers on the table, because that's what newsreaders used to do, and tap their paper. And then a lot of them still do it, actually, where they, and who knows what they're writing, but they do a kind of little flourish, almost like a pianist on their keyboard now. And it's just a way of saying the bulletin is over. But yeah, I used to do that. So I wanted to be a journalist and a newsreader, and and actually at football grounds, people often say, "Oh, it's that newsreader." So I've sort of achieved that in.
So you're a trained journalist. So is that your training then, as a journalist?
Yeah, Hogwarts journalism school I went to. No, I didn't. I was trained on newspapers, but I So I've been. I write for the Guardian now still. Yeah. Various other people, but. So yeah, I've been 4 decades actually. I've been a print journalist, and then I've done all the other stuff around that. But I don't think I've never actually stopped being a print journalist. I've always done some, because I love writing. I love broadcasting, but writing is really what is at the heart of it for me. And so in the broadcasting, which was controversial, but I wrote my own scripts and I wrote my own questions, and a lot of people don't. Even some very well-known people are just handed the questions and script when they go in. And I could never understand that. I think it has to come from your own head. To take people into the mystery now, you're holding a sheet of paper which you've written, and I think that's the only way to do a decent interview, actually. And I can normally tell, driving around the country, I can always tell if it's the interviewer's own questions or not. Because they do something slightly inflected where they're reading questions they've been given by the producer, because they don't come from their heart, brain, soul.
I'm not an interviewer. I'm just...
Well, you are.
I suppose I am now.
Well, you are now, yeah. Yeah.
But it wouldn't even occur to me to ask someone. I'd be too nervous. I'd be
Yeah.
I don't even know what that question, especially having dyslexia, I wouldn't even know what... I find it difficult to read my own questions. What do I even mean? I have to bury into what I mean.
No, that's true. So you'd find it very hard to... I was never able to. I mean, very occasionally, like if it was at the BBC, if it was something, I mean, during wars, for example, I would be handed a piece of paper that came from above, which you were supposed to read. You know, we're going over to the newsroom because of developments and whatever. As you say, I could never read that because I hadn't written it.
No.
Whereas I could have ad-libbed it, but of course they wouldn't allow that because, which you might say the wrong thing.
So your journalism, has it always been within the arts?
Well, I did both together in parallel for the Times, Sunday Times, and the Independent for a long time, and the Guardian. But yeah, I did lots of political journalism. I was a parliamentary sketch writer, which which is like being a political theatre critic, really. So there's an overlap, and there are lots of us who have done both. And I was one of the ones which Quentin Letts did recently, did it at the same time, where you were going from one to the other. And, officially the difference is that if you go to theatre, it's scripted, and if you go to the House of Commons, it isn't. But, of course, increasingly in the House of Commons, it is. So, yeah, and I'm pretty obsessed with politics. I covered, I think, three American elections and a couple of Indian ones. The death of the last Japanese emperor, I mean the most recent one, as it were, to die, because the other one retired, I think, recently. So yeah, that's kind of thing. So I was a feature writer for a long time, and I'm still a theatre critic and TV critic. But yeah, politics I've always written about.
I've never really watched mainstream television a lot. But for some reason, I'd watch something like that and find it interesting. And so when I found out that you were pro-Chancellor,
yeah,
I was like, oh, great, that's so exciting. If I ever happen to see you, I'm going to ask you to come on my podcast.
Which you did, and I have, and we were, yes, because one of my duties is to hand out degrees to your students and other people's students. But yeah, that's where we met. And it's very gratifying, I find them very moving those days, because this is an relatively unusual university in that there doesn't seem to be a lot of entitlement or privilege among the students here. And so you really see what it means to their families. I mean, the whooping from some of the families is just an amazing thing. So yeah.
Well, thanks very much for that. So I was interested to hear your comment just now then about writing being your primary or your preferred choice. So what is it about writing then? Is it the fact that you're on your own with your imagination? Like I think Terry Pratchett said, like wizards create their own world, and I think writers, I'm in my own world that I've created.
For me, writing is not just being in your own world. So. Writing scripts for radio or writing the questions for those BBC4 TV interviews, I was going to do in public or on screen. And I've written 25 radio plays. One just went out recently called Transparency on Radio 4. So in those cases, you're writing for an audience, for actors. So I don't get entirely solitary. I am, and I think it's deep in the history of music, I think, as well, is the mystical aspect of it, which there is. I mean, I'm writing a novel at the moment, and I'm quite deep into it. And I wake up every morning and I've dreamed in character whole sections of it, and I just write them down, basically. And even having written for a long time, I find that really... I just find it astonishing, because so much of it happens in the subconscious, and that all the writers across many genres and the musicians, it does happen like that. A line just comes into their head. I mean, I was walking across Milton Keynes Station Concourse this morning on my way to get my car to come here, and I got a whole paragraph of something I'm writing, and so. I think, and you have to learn to trust that, I think, that it does, that your subconscious does so much of the work for you. And you just have to be grateful for that. I mean, one of my children is a very good mathematician, and mathematicians say if you can't work something out, just read it, go to sleep, and when you wake up, you'll have done it. And I find that amazing. But that is true with writing. If I get stuck, I just read it, go to sleep, and then you wake up with the next bit.
You remind me of a little bit of David Lynch.
I know, we have very similar hair. No, that doesn't work on a podcast, but yeah. No, he had a lot of hair, and I don't have any. But but I think it's true of most people. I think it does. There was a saying at the BBC, I think in the 80s, when Thatcher was in charge, that because there are a lot of writers like this, but they used to say, never ever tell the drama department that it came to you in a dream, because that was seen as I think in some weird way left-wing or dangerous, or I think that you weren't in control of it. And then there's an underlying implication is that actually, when you think about it, and I'm only thinking about this now, it would go back to the distrust of drug-fueled writing in the 60s and 70s, which was that if it came from somewhere else, but it all comes from somewhere else, it must do. High on your own supply, as they say. Yeah, no, it's true.
Or you're open, you don't have the barriers somehow.
Yes, but I think that's important, and I think, particularly for students and people who are writing music or words now, being open is...
Are you naturally open, do you think, or is it something you've had to work on?
No, I've had to learn it because, when you start, I found when you start, but I think this is common for a lot of people, you close down a lot of your imagination and your subconscious, and you want to be in control of it. And I think gradually you learn that you're not. And I, writing fiction, I found this really interesting because... I used to laugh as an interviewer, and internally, not externally, and I understand why people do now when writers would say, I'm not in control of it, the characters just do, they take over, and I used to think, don't be ridiculous, that's the metaphor for, you're in control of them. But it is, all I can say about this is that the number of times characters in fiction, in plays and novels, it's like having toddlers, really. They say, I want to go and get in that car, or I want to go onto that beach. And you say, no, you're not. No, you're really not, because the next scene is in a cafe, and that's where you're going. And they say, well, I want to go to the beach. And then what you learn, and we have to be very careful about this. With toddlers, it's really important to stop them going where they think they want to. But with characters in fiction, you always should. Because it doesn't always work, but, there'll be a moment when you think, oh, that's why you wanted to be. And I think, and so many people have said this, but John le Carré, Philip Roth, Paul Simon, so people in different fields, Stephen Sondheim, have said that fluency can be a risk and a trap, that if it's going really, really well, it can mean you're just... Stephen Sondheim said this about muscle memory, that if you're sitting at a piano, that you just write something you've written before. And I think that's... so you can have a terrible, terrible morning or afternoon or whole day, and then at the end of it, there's something there. You have to work for them. But I think they pretty much all said that the poems that came, or songs that came easily, sometimes they were the best ones. I was very lucky to interview Leonard Cohen, which had been one of my lifetime dreams, and I interviewed him for Radio 4 relatively late in his life. And he'd had this conversation with Bob Dylan, where Bob Dylan said it took him 10 minutes to write one of the songs, Desolation Row or whatever. And Leonard Cohen, it had taken him 4 years to write one of the songs. And if you look, he showed me his notebooks, and just verse after verse after verse of Hallelujah. And then there were 53 verses or something in existence, and you just get some of them. And each of them with a rhyme for Hallelujah. Yeah. What's it to you? Yeah. But now you never show it to me, do you? And they're all there. Oh, and then his greatest rhyme in Hallelujah is, all I ever learned from love is how to shoot at someone who outdrew you. And I thought I think that's an amazing line. It comes out of the Old Testament, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah, you see, well, Leonard Cohen clearly is one of the great geniuses, but I think, having come up with the line, I've heard there was a secret chord that David
Wrote and it pleased the Lord.
wrote and it pleased the Lord. You can imagine with a less original lyricist where that might go, that it would become an entirely, I mean, like something from Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat or something Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber. But it goes into these bizarre...
But you don't care for music, do you?
Do you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it becomes about a relationship, as so much of his songs do. But then it becomes domesticated. They tied you to a kitchen
But it's
chair.
coherent. There's not, it's not an incoherent thing. It all makes sense somehow.
It does all make sense.
Well, yeah, on some level, I don't know how. Yeah. And in that song from his album, from a musical point of view, he has this. I'm calling it a structural silence, and the one of the choruses where they all just stop for half a bar, and then after that point, the length of the chorus changes. So, which I don't think anyone spotted that before, but I don't even know if he had. But it's like a 5. Trying to remember, but an odd number length of bars, and then he has this silence, and then there's no new material coming in that song after that, and it's 4 bars, and it just fades out.
Wow. You see, I got into, which I generally did, got into music through literature, being a literature student, because I was a big fan of Lorca, the tragic Spanish, in every sense, tragic writer. Yeah. As he died very young. But then I read somewhere that Leonard Cohen had adapted a poem by Lorca, which is Take This Waltz. And so that I tended to get into music that way. And so the St. Matthew Passion, Bach, that was in a book by Joseph Heller where he said it was the greatest piece of music ever written. So then I listened to that. And then I had what I thought was a lunatic insight, but then it turned out that at least the writer agreed with it. But I was doing T.S. Eliot for A-level, and I became obsessed. I mean, we say rabbit hole now, but in those days there was no internet, so you just had to do it in your head or on paper. But I became obsessed with, as I saw it, similarities between the poetry of T.S. Eliot and the lyrics of Paul Simon. A particular example being the moon rose over an open field, which I think could come from either, but also the use of speech in both, because Eliot introduced vernacular speech. So particularly in The Wasteland, there are these women talking in a pub, and I vividly remember thinking, wow, that's just like the moment in Paul Simon's America. Pass me a cigarette. I think there's one in my raincoat. I smoked the last one an hour ago. And it's dialogue within a song. Anyway, so I was obsessed with this, and I wrote an essay on this, which my very indulgent English teacher thought was interesting. And then decades later, I asked Paul Simon about this and said, was I mad? And he said, no, I wasn't, and that he was heavily influenced by T.S. Eliot. So there you are. So that's another of my lessons to the young, is to try to... I mean, I think there's a continuum you see across culture and the arts. Try not to get trapped into one silo. Because I think painting influences music and then theatre. I think there's so much crossover, particularly now, that I think it's important to be open to as many bits. I mean, I'm a theatre critic, and there are theatre critics who don't have and don't watch televisions. But then they're astonished when they say, oh, there's this rather interesting, new actor, and they've actually been on TV for 10 to 20 years. So I think, and there's obviously, there's much more overlap between cinema, theatre, TV than some other art forms. But there are those overlaps.
Definitely.
As they come out. But yeah, you see, the thing you say about classical music, I have a story about that. I have a story about most things, having interviewed thousands of people. But Thomas Allen, the great Northeastern opera singer, he appeared in at the Royal Opera House in Stephen Sondheim's Sweeney Todd, which had originated on Broadway and then West End musical theatre and still is there sometimes. But anyway, the Opera House has taken it up. So that's one example. So Sondheim, who was always told that, he wasn't an opera composer, he was a musical theatre composer. But in fact, we again see that there's crossover there. But when he went round to see Thomas Allen after the first night of the premiere of Sweeney Todd at the Royal Opera House, and he said, he's very, very good. And Thomas Allen said, I hope it was all right because some of it sat a little low in the voice. And he sometimes said, you should have told me, I'd have rewritten it for you. And Allen was absolutely gobsmacked by this because, as you say, the promise of classical musicians and singers and players is deliver it as written. And that's I've always remembered that story because in musical theatre, I'm obsessed, particularly with Sondheim, but there are entire albums of songs that got cut during the tryouts on the road or in rehearsals or even when he was writing them. So musicals are rewritten, whereas operas are, and I understand why. It's because of the orchestration. Once you start messing around with an opera, it's quite tricky because you can't you can rewrite with a drama. You can rewrite a word quite easily, or with a quite simple melodic song, but you can't do that in opera. But it's very interesting to me that you have a form that is almost entirely achieved in the rewriting, and then one where there can be no rewriting, and then some people argue that's that leads to the relative popularity of both forms. But Sondheim was asked to write for the Opera House and never would because he said, well, they give you 5 performances, and he just some of his more outrageous commercial flops did get 5 performances in musical theatre, but that wasn't the intention. That was what happened. Yeah. And then others ran for many years.
Yeah, and I think the reality is.
Thomas Allen, the great Northeastern opera singer, he appeared in at the Royal Opera House in Stephen Sondheim's Sweeney Todd, which had originated on Broadway and then West End musical theatre and still is there sometimes. But anyway, the Opera House has taken it up. So that's one example. So Sondheim, who was always told that he wasn't an opera composer, he was a musical theatre composer. But in fact, we again see that there's crossover there. But when he went round to see Thomas Allen after the first night of the premiere of Sweeney Todd at the Royal Opera House, and he said, he's very, very good. And Thomas Allen said, I hope it was all right because some of it sat a little low in the voice. And he sometimes said, you should have told me, I'd have rewritten it for you. And Allen was absolutely gobsmacked by this because, as you say, the promise of classical musicians and singers and players is deliver it as written. And that's I've always remembered that story because in musical theatre, I'm obsessed, particularly with Sondheim, but there are entire albums of songs that got cut during the tryouts on the road or in rehearsals or even when he was writing them. So musicals are rewritten, whereas operas are, and I understand why. It's because of the orchestration. Once you start messing around with an opera, it's quite tricky because you can't you can rewrite with a drama. You can rewrite a word quite easily, or with a quite simple melodic song, but you can't do that in opera. But it's very interesting to me that you have a form that is almost entirely achieved in the rewriting, and then one where there can be no rewriting. And then some people argue that's, that leads to the relative popularity of both forms. But, sometimes was asked to write for the Opera House and never would, because he said, well, they give you 5 performances. And he just... And some of his more outrageous commercial flops did get 5 performances in musical theatre, but that wasn't the intention. That was what happened.
Yeah.
And then others ran for many years. One of my newer musical obsessions, Caroline Shaw. I mean, she's a singer, percussionist, composer, but she will just start with an improvised rhythm, and then they all pick it up, and then she starts singing, and then it leads to composition. But they do this in the studio, and that again gets away from the idea that it should be someone just sitting there with manuscript paper. And but yeah, I think that's the really important insight, is that people don't separate. I think also, which I was brought up with this, Catholic with a small c thing, which has certainly been all my journalism as broadcasting has been about this. It's a completely irrelevant question to me whether West Side Story is better or worse than Romeo and Juliet. I mean, they're different tellings of the same story, and probably because we don't, we have no idea how accurate the Shakespeare texts we have are. Probably Romeo and Juliet has more obvious flaws in it than West Side Story has. But actually, that's another side. I just have so many of these stories. But in one of my many interviews with Stephen Sondheim, he talked about this, that Leonard Bernstein had already... Well, he'd written some of the music for West Side Story, but he was incredibly stretched and he was doing several other projects. So, that question that is always asked, which comes first, the words or the music? In some cases, he had to squeeze the lyrics into the bar length that Bernstein had already chosen. And then other times, he was writing these long lyrics, which Bernstein then set. So, and I think that's one of the reasons that that's such an interesting musical, is that it was written in various different ways. Sometimes the lyricist leading it, and sometimes the composer leading it. And I think it gives you great variety.
If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please like and subscribe, and don't be shy to leave a comment too. Thank you so much for listening.